This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order every card in this set review by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or by following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Brothers War set review. So far, we've looked at all the non-green cards in the main set, and today we're continuing with a look at those green cards. Before we take a look at the first green card, a few reminders. This review is about limited in the new format. That means draft and seal. This means that I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also keep in mind that these are my thoughts about these cards before ever playing with the format, and that means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. But I'll be providing updates as I play more of the format. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the review. First, there's Alloy Animist, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 uncommon human druid, and you can pay 2 generic and a green, and until end of turn, target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature. With all the Power Stones around, this ability is going to overperform, between the fact that Power Stones can pay for the ability, and you can actually animate them with the ability too. This looks like a good place to sink mana and win the game. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Argothian Opportunist, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 human scout at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a tapped Power Stone token. This is an artifact with tap, add colorless. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. This seems like a bread and butter common for green decks. It has passable stats and gets you some Power Stone ramp going, which is definitely something green is interested in. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Argothian Sprite, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 fairy at common. It can't be blocked by artifact creatures, and you can pay 7 generic to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. This is better than it looks. There's lots of artifact creatures in the set, including most of the format's creature tokens, so this will be a nice attacker on a whole lot of boards, and then in the mid to late game, you can buff it to make sure it stays relevant. Power Stones make an ability like this far easier to use than it would be in a normal format. This looks like a pretty high quality 2-drop, especially at common for green decks in the format. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Audacity, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. The enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has trample, and when Audacity is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. I like this aura. It's basically a fixed rancor, which is pretty fun. +2/+0 and trample is enough to make a whole lot of creatures problematic, and the fact you get to draw a card when Audacity goes to the graveyard means you don't have to worry about getting 2 for 1 like you do with most auras. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Awaken the Woods, which for X and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says create X 1/1 green forest dryad land creature tokens. Note that these are creature tokens that are also lands. Basically, this creates an army of dryad arbors, which is pretty cool. This gives you a lot of bodies and also ramps you. It seems like this is pretty good at most stages of the game. If you imagine paying 4 total to get 2 1/1s that can tap for green, that sounds pretty good, as it lets you build out your board a little bit and allows you to keep ramping. Then, if you get it in the late game, you can just crank out a bunch of tokens, which almost always are going to help you win the game. Even if you're behind, making a bunch of tokens can often allow you to stabilize. It is a little sad that the format's main way of ramping, Power Stones, can't pay for it, but this still looks pretty great. I think this gets into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Blanchwood Armor, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. This is a reprint, and it is not especially good in limited. It can offer a huge boost, especially if you're heavy green, but it doesn't do enough to mitigate against the downside of getting 2 for 1. There are some good targets for it in the format, but having one of those targets in play is additional setup in addition to needing a bunch of forests. I think this is an F in a deck that isn't really heavy into green, and a C at best in heavy green decks. Next up, it's Blanchwood Prowler, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 elemental at common. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, and you may put a land card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on Blanchwood Prowler. This is either a 2 mana 1/1 that draws you a land and loads your graveyard a bit, or a 2 mana 2/2 that loads your graveyard. Both of those options are solid, especially because green likes milling itself in this format, so there's some extra value there. And, you know, this is going to be pretty good at just helping you hit a land drop too. I think this is a C+. Next, it's Burrowing Razormaw, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 beast at common. When it dies, mill 4 cards. This has fine stats and it does an alright job of loading your graveyard. It's a C. Next up, it's Bushwhack, which for 1 green is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose one, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put into your hand, and then shuffle, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. This is nice. Each of these modes are cards that you would generally play. Neither of them is incredible, but fixing your mana by searching up a basic land for 1 green, or playing a card that is Prey Upon, which is literally what the second effect of this card is. It allows you to fight your opponent's thing with your thing for 1 green mana. Both of those are cards that have seen play in the past, so putting them both together here is pretty nice. I think giving these modal effects really is a big upgrade for both of these effects, because when you don't need a land, you can probably make use of the fight part, and when you can't really make use of the fight part, you probably need a land. So overall, I think this looks pretty good, I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sentinel Steward, which for 1 green is a 1/1 Elf Druid Soldier at common, and you can tap it and tap an untapped artifact or creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. Even with Power Stones, it can be a little tricky finding a way to consistently use this to fix and ramp your mana. There will be times where you just can't do it, and it's an ability that isn't that great in the late game. That said, this format does have many payoffs for doing such a thing, and the Power Stones certainly make this easier. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Epic Confrontation, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. This is a reprint, and it was a premium removal spell last time. The stats boost is surprisingly effective at helping your creature win fights. You do have to be careful with this kind of removal spell, because if your opponent can respond by removing your creature, you get utterly blown out, and that does matter, but you can often find a good window to cast this. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Fade from History, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery. It says each player who controls an artifact or enchantment creates a 2/2 green bear creature token, then destroy all artifacts and enchantments. This feels mostly like a sideboard card. This set will have a few different archetypes focused on artifacts, and bringing this in against them is pretty good. It will usually feel well worth it to give your opponent a 2/2 to destroy several permanents. You don't want to run this, though, if you're interested in running artifacts yourself. You want to use it when it's fairly one-sided. And there are lots of decks in the format that this really won't affect very much, and that's what really makes it sort of a sideboard card that's just not always going to work out. I think it's probably an F in your main deck and a B- out of your sideboard. If you are like a black-green graveyard deck that's not that interested in doing artifact things, this is a pretty incredible card to bring out of your sideboard. Next, it's Philology Excavation, which for 3 generic and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery. Create 3 tapped Power Stone tokens. You gain 3 life. As you can see, Power Stone ramp is a very real thing in this format. There are plenty of sweet artifacts to ramp into, so this will often precede you slamming a scary 8-drop on the next turn. Now, it doesn't really impact the board immediately, and that can be a problem, but gaining 3 life when you cast this makes it more likely you can endure a hard hit on your opponent's turn, which makes it more likely you untap and slam that creature on the table. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Fauna Shaman, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Elf Shaman at rare. You can pay 1 green and tap it and discard a creature card. To search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This is a neat reprint. It starts with passable stats and comes with the ability to search up creatures, which is pretty good. Now, that ability is significantly weaker than it might look at first, mostly because you have to give up a creature to get a creature. So you're really just getting card selection, and it's not amazing card selection because you're still giving up a creature. You can never give up a land you don't need or something. Card selection is nice, but you have to weigh whether using this ability is worth more than just casting the creature you're thinking about discarding. The answer to that is usually dependent on the contents of your deck and whether there are any creatures who are better in a particular situation. If you have a bomb creature or 2, this gets a lot better. One nice thing here is that the Shaman synergizes well with the black-green deck in the format, which wants creatures in the graveyard in the first place. So actually getting those creatures in the graveyard while searching up the payoffs for getting things in the graveyard seems pretty sweet. Overall, I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Fog of War, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. You gain 1 life for each creature on the battlefield. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures with power 3 or less. Yeah, no thank you. Fogs are always bad and limited. You spend a card to delay the inevitable in most cases. People always talk about the scenarios where you can cast something like this when your opponent alpha strikes, then you survive and you alpha strike back to win the game. And sure, that happens, but it's so bad in every other situation that you just can't run it for that small upside. And this one's even worse than most of them in some ways because it doesn't even prevent damage done by larger creatures. It does also gain you life, which is a thing, and does help you find a way to stabilize maybe a little better than most fog effects might because of the potential life gain. but it still doesn't really feel like it does enough, especially because it's a narrow fog effect. It would be kind of interesting if they hadn't put the creatures with power 3 or less clause on it. Might be too good for constructed if they did that, I guess, but in limited, you know, I'm still not 100% sure I'd want to play a fog in that situation. So that tells you something that this is an F. Next, it's Gaya's Courser, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/5 Centaur Soldier at uncommon. When it attacks, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, draw a card. This is a pretty nice payoff for the graveyard decks in the format. I do think it's a little disappointing maybe for an uncommon that's meant to be one of the premier payoffs for getting creatures in your graveyard. This is because it has below rate stats and it has to attack to trigger the ability. Both of those things being true isn't something I love. Now, you're going to feel pretty good about this card anyway if you can draw a card with it and trade it off, and if your opponent can't trade with it and it just keeps drawing you cards, it's going to be insane. It's still a very good card, I just kind of wish it was a 5/5 or something. Still, it's a B-, and you know, any creature-heavy green deck can play it, but obviously the black-green deck is going to get the most mileage out of it. Next up, it's Gaia's Gift, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains reach, trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. This looks like a nice trick. In addition to doing a good job of helping creatures win combat, the slew of keywords it gets makes it so you can blank most removal when you cast it. We've seen a lot of tricks like this lately, and they've all ended up being a card you want 1 or 2 of in your aggressive decks, and I think that's what we have here. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Giant Growth, which for 1 green mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Giant Growth is back yet again, and as always, it's a pretty solid trick. 1 mana for this stats boost lets your creature win a whole lot of combats, and you can do it for a very, very low investment, giving you a nice advantage. Aggressive green decks in the format will basically always want at least one of these. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Gnarlroot Pallbearer, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 Treefolk Druid at common. It's got Trample, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This doesn't have the best stat line, but a 6 mana 5/5 Trampler is kind of passable. And the enter the battlefield trigger will be pretty effective in a lot of green decks, allowing you to attack with something that just couldn't before. Still, it is rather expensive and dependent on your graveyard. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 legendary elf druid scout at rare. You can tap her to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of a creature or creature card. Whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, and untap it. This is great. Giving you 2 mana, even for only a creature spell or activated ability, if you can play this on turn 3 and then play a 6 mana creature on turn 4, that's just going to be enough to win you the game pretty consistently, especially because Gwenna also becomes a 3/4 when you do it. This format has a lot of activated abilities too, mostly so Power Stones can do something other than play artifact spells, but her ability works with abilities too. The one downside is that this is not the greatest top deck in like the mid to late game when you've sort of played everything out, but the fail case is still a 3 mana 2/3 that might get a little bit bigger in a couple more turns if you just draw something big. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Hoarding Recluse, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/3 spider at common. It's got reach and death touch, and when it dies, you put up to 1 other target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. This can trade for anything, including flyers, and while that's not the most exciting thing on a 4 mana card, it does make it so that it certainly impacts the board when it's around. And the death ability matters a little bit here too, as green-black decks will be milling themselves a significant chunk of the time, and sometimes you end up milling things you didn't really want to mill, and this can help get that card back. You can also take away a card with Unearth that your opponent has in their graveyard. It doesn't really do anything super well, but it does a whole bunch of relevant stuff, and I think that makes it a C. Next, it's Obstinate Baloth, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 beast at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life, and if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard the Baloth, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. This is a reprint and one that got downshifted from rare. A 4 mana 4/4 that gains you 4 when it enters is just a great card in limited. It gives you an efficient creature and a very relevant body to help you pull ahead of your opponent if they were having an aggressive start. The discard part of the card is not going to come up much, but when it does, it will be pretty hilarious to put this into play for free. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Perimeter Patrol, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 human soldier at common. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. A 3-mana 3/3 is usually still a C. That's a stat line that has continued to be pretty solid throughout the history of Magic, and this has some real upside that will let it attack a lot more effectively. There are lots of artifacts around, and it counts Power Stones. The green-white deck in particular is interested in triggering these sorts of abilities as much as possible, and it certainly looks capable of doing it. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Sarenth Steelseeker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/2 human artificer scouted uncommon. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it into your hand. If you don't put the card into your hand, you may put it into your graveyard. This looks really good. The format has a lot of artifacts, again, including Power Stones, and this trigger does count those. And it also isn't limited to once per turn, which is awesome. Basically, every time you put an artifact in play, you either draw a card or surveil one, and that's a trigger that will generate some pretty amazing value over time. This looks like it could be a pretty impressive engine, and that's an exciting thing to say about a 2-drop. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Shoot Down, which for 3 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says exile target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. This has a whole lot of targets in this format. It is a little clunky as a 4-mana sorcery, but it just feels like this will be able to deal with enough permanence in the format that I think the first copy should be valued reasonably highly. It's even nice that it exiles things in a format with Unearth and stuff like that. I think the first copy of this is a C+. Next, it's Tanos' Tinkering, which for 3 generic and a green is a common instant. It says put 2 +1/+1 counters on target artifact, creature, or land you control. Untap that permanent. If it isn't a creature, it becomes a 0/0 creature in addition to its other types. Using this to put counters on something that's already a creature doesn't feel amazing for this cost. It's basically a really bad combat trick. But if you can use it to animate a land or an artifact, it does get a little more interesting because it turns a card that wasn't impacting the board into one that does. That said, I feel like actually generating a card of value with this is going to be a little bit challenging. It's far too expensive and underpowered to be the kind of card that you really just treat as like a trick that you want to run in your deck, because you have to leave up so much mana for it for a relatively small boost if you're looking at it as a trick. And then the upside of animating Power Stones and lands isn't exactly exciting either. I think it's probably just a D+. Next, it's Titania, Voice of Jaya, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 legendary elemental at Mythic Rare. She's got Reach. Whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you gain 2 life. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more land cards in your graveyard and you both own and control Titania, Voice of Jaya, and a land named Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, which we saw earlier this week, then meld them together into Titania, Jaya Incarnate. So, a 3-mana 3/4 with Reach is easily a C+ and maybe just a B-. So the other upside is nice to have, especially because green does have a decent amount of mill, which will result in you gaining some life, especially if you have Evolving Wilds around. She also needs self-mill to get to the point where she can meld, so that's kind of the deck she'll fit in, but you can't really count on it. It involves having this mythic in play and a rare, and then also meeting the requirement it asks of you. And while the land that she melds with does also mill you, so it's not impossible if you get them both, it does take some work, and the chances of, again, not only drafting each of them, but then also having them both in play and then also meeting the requirement, you're talking about really low percentage of the time actually happening. Obviously, it is upside. It would be worse if it couldn't meld, but we really can't have that reflected in the grade because it's relevant such a low percentage of the time. Good news is she's a pretty good card anyway. I think she's a B-. Next up, it's Teething Wormlet, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 worm. At rare, it has Death Touch as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. And whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. If this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Teething Wormlet. This is an impressive 1-drop. Gaining 1 life every single time an artifact enters under your control is already pretty nice incidental life gain, but it really gets pushed over the top by the fact that it gets a +1/+1 counter the first time you have an artifact enter the battlefield every turn. Again, green-white is all about triggering these when an artifact enters the battlefield triggers, and it will easily work in that sort of deck, but, most green decks in this format are going to have enough artifacts that this is a very good card. It is vulnerable early, but it can really run away with the game for you, and the stuff that it does for you while it is alive is always going to be pretty helpful. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Titania's Command, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery. It says, choose one, exile target player's graveyard, you gain 1 life for each card exiled this way, search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, create 2 2/2 green bear creature tokens, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This is the most expensive of all the commands in the set. I mean, I guess the Mishra one costs X, but you know what I mean. But I also think this is the best one for limited. You don't really have as many options that will actually be useful once you get to 6 mana with this one, as you'll almost always choose the last 2 options of making 2 2/2 bears and getting 2 +1/+1 counters on your whole board. But that means that the floor of this card is 6 mana to make 2 4/4s. And your board isn't just going to be empty beyond that. You're going to add a lot more power and toughness to the board when you use that ability. And then you, of course, have these other abilities if you, for whatever reason, really need to ramp more or really want to exile your opponent's graveyard and gain some life. There are times where you need to do those things. That's just additional upside on a sorcery that is insanely powerful already, just with the bottom 2 options. I think I gave a B+ to all of the other commands, and I think this one is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Tamakul Honor Guard, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 human soldier at common with Ward 2. This has solid stats, and cheap removal will cost extra to destroy it. The format does have a bunch of 1/1 tokens, though, which pushes back on how good that Ward 2 or how much that Ward 2 matters a little bit. But it seems like a solid 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Wasteful Harvest, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. It says mill 5 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. So, as I've said, this format does have a green deck that really wants to mill cards, but I don't love this. 3 mana to get a single permanent back from the graveyard is pretty underwhelming, even with mill attached. I'd much rather impact the board with these creatures that we've seen that mill you and then give you some sort of value than I would cast a spell that mills me and gets back 1 permanent. And the permanent also has to be one of the 5 that are milled. So it's more restrictive than some effects like this we've seen before, where you just get any permanent back from the graveyard. If you're the most graveyardy black-green deck ever, maybe you end up playing it because, you want to mill yourself as much as possible, but I think it's a D+. All right, now we're moving into the artifacts that have a green identity, and we're starting with Boulder Branch Golem, which for 7 generic is a 6/5 golem at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to its power, and it has prototype, which means you can pay this alternate cost so that it has a different mana cost, color, and size, but keeps its abilities. In this case, you can pay 3 generic and a green to get a 3/3. A 4-mana 3/3 that gains you 3 when it enters the battlefield is like a C. And the upside here is going to be the kind of card that really allows you to stabilize, as a 6/5 that gains you 6 is going to make any opponent who had a fast start pretty sad. You can also ramp into it, of course, with the help of Power Stones. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Cradle Clear Cutter, which for 6 generic mana is a 3/6 artifact creature golem at uncommon. You can tap it to add an amount of green equal to its power, and it has prototype for 2 generic and a green, and it's a 1/3. So a 3 mana 1/3 that taps for 1 green and, has a little bit of upside to maybe tap for more if you augment its stats, that's probably a C. Maybe a C+ in this set, which likes artifacts and ramp. In some ways, I feel like casting this as the bigger version is less attractive than most of the others, as you're less likely to want a bunch of mana, even in this format, but you still get to play out a much larger creature who's more impactful on the board by the stage of the game when you can actually pay all of that extra mana. I think this is a C+. Next, it's Haywire Might, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 artifact creature insect at uncommon. When it dies, you gain 2 life. You can pay 1 green and sacrifice it to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Obviously, only hitting non-creature artifacts is a problem, but there are lots of artifacts and enchantments in this format that it can still hit. So I think this is a main deck card. Doesn't hurt that it's also a cheap artifact in a format that cares about those things. I think it's a C. Next, it's Iron Craw Crusher, which for 7 generic mana is a 4/6 artifact creature worm at uncommon. When it attacks, target attacking creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is Iron Craw Crusher's power, and it has prototype for 2 generic and 2 green, and it's a 2/5. Both modes on this are pretty solid. Neither is amazing. That's true of the majority of the lower rarity prototypes. Obviously, the 4/6 version can be a bigger problem, but costing 7 is no small thing. Meanwhile, the prototype is itself a mediocre attacker with only 2 power, and the boost isn't that impressive either, but the high toughness that both of these has means they'll often be able to attack pretty effectively while buffing something else enough that your opponent also has to be worried about it. I can just see this producing some pretty reasonable attacks the turn after it comes down, giving it a C+. Next, it's Mask of the Jade Crafter, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay X, tap it, and sacrifice it to create an XX colorless golem artifact creature token, activate only as a sorcery, and it has Unearth for 2 generic and a green, which means you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, then exile it at the beginning of the next instep, or if it would leave the battlefield, Unearth only as a sorcery. So, this is a pretty nice thing to spend your Power Stone mana on, since it can make a reasonably efficient token. I mean, it's sort of never going to be efficient because you have to pay to cast it or unearth it, and then you have to pay the ability. But it is often going to be big because you just have the mana lying around. The bad news is that this is not a very good card like to have in your opening hand. You really don't want to be playing this on turn 2. This is something you want to do in the later game, and if it's in your deck, it's not always going to work out that way. It does give you 2 bodies in the end, but having to unearth first also means it's even harder to create a large token with the ability. I think this is probably just a C. Next, it's Perennial Behemoth, which for 5 generic is a 2/7 artifact creature beast at rare. You can play lands from your graveyard, and it has Unearth for 2 green. Green decks in this format will be milling themselves, and Evolving Wilds at common also means you'll frequently have a land that will put itself in the graveyard, and that is kind of a sweet combo. But this also has some passable defensive stats, and the ability to come back from the graveyard is some nice additional upside. If you're milling yourself, as you're likely to be doing with a green deck, you could unearth this and then play a land from your graveyard, which is some nice value. Still, it takes some work for it to do its best, and it's never going to do anything insane in your typical game of limited. It's probably just a C. Next, it's Rootwire Amalgam, which for 5 generic is a 5/5 artifact creature golem at Mythic rare. You can pay 3 generic and 2 green and sacrifice it to create an XX colorless golem artifact creature token, where X is 3 times Rootwire Amalgam's power. It gains haste until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery, and it has prototype for 1 generic and a green, in which case it's a 2/3. So this is great no matter which mode you choose to cast it in. If you need a 2-drop, it does a fine job, especially because you can turn it into a 6/6 token with haste at some point, but waiting to cast it until you have 5 mana is obviously way better because you get a 15/15 with haste when you use the ability, and that's pretty crazy. It's definitely a bomb, though I think it is only an A- level bomb. To get a full-blown A or A+, you have to be a bomb that gives you serious value, even if your opponent manages to kill it when they untap on their turn, and this isn't that. Unfortunately, if they deal with it, they deal with it, and you don't get anything. And the same can be said, if you just use the ability and your opponent has removal, that isn't awesome either. Still, the ceiling is insanely high, the floor is also very high, giving it an A-. Next, it's Rust Goliath, which for 10 generic mana is a artifact creature construct at common. It's a 10/10 with reach and trample, and it has prototype for 3 generic and 2 green, in which case it's a 3/5. A 5 mana 3/5 with reach and trample isn't amazing, and if this card was also only a 10 mana 10/10 with reach and trample, I wouldn't love that either. But again, the fact you can cast this as an okay-ish creature for 5 if you need something in the early game, or cast it in the late game as a huge monster is pretty nice. And I feel like Power Stone decks are going to be really interested in this common as a potential win condition. A 10/10 with trample is no joke, and decks can reasonably get there in this format. I'm giving this a C+. And our last card for the video is Simian Simulacrum, which for 3 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature ape at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and it has Unearth for 2 generic and 2 green. This is great. On its own, it can be a 3 mana 4/3, and you'll often have some better bodies to put it on. In fact, you'll usually have some other things to put it on, especially because you're kind of interested in trading this off so you can unearth it and get more counters. I think the efficiency and the value you get out of leaving these tokens behind makes this a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. So those are all the green cards in the Brothers War. We've now looked at all the cards in the main set, but draft boosters for this set will also contain retro frame artifacts, which are sort of like the Mystical Archive in Strixhaven. There is going to be one of them in every pack, so I figured I'm going to review them too. Tomorrow I'll be back with a look at all of those retro frame artifacts. If you want to make sure you catch that video, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch up on the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist shortly. Thanks for watching.